What if much of the suffering you carry every day is not the fault of people, or circumstances, or even problems, but of something that happens silently inside your own mind? Not something extraordinary, not something strange, something everyday, almost invisible, so normalized that you no longer question it. More than 2,000 years ago, Buddha observed that the human mind becomes gradually poisoned, without the person even realizing it. Not with external poisons, but with internal patterns that distort how you perceive reality. Patterns that condition your decisions, your relationships, and your emotional state. Patterns that, if you don't recognize them, govern your life from the shadows. He called these patterns the poisons of the mind. These are not poetic metaphors. They are deep psychological mechanisms that remain active today exactly as they were then. And the most disturbing thing is this: you can have a good life, good intentions, even some spiritual awareness, and still be dominated by them without knowing it. The first poison is the most socially accepted, the most normalized, even the most applauded. And precisely for that reason, it is the most dangerous. This poison manifests as attachment. Attachment is not simply wanting something. It is not enjoying. It is not loving. Attachment occurs when your mind begins to believe that your well-being depends on having, keeping, or controlling something. Being emotionally dependent on someone, needing recognition to feel valued, clinging to an image of success, clinging to how things should be, clinging to a past version of yourself, clinging to a future expectation. Attachment constantly whispers a promise. When I achieve this, I'll be okay. If I don't lose that, I'll be at peace. If things stay this way, I'll be able to breathe easy. And while that promise guides your life, your mind lives in tension. Because reality has one fundamental characteristic: everything changes. People change, circumstances change, the body changes, emotions change, relationships change, even you change. Attachment attempts to freeze what is inherently impermanent. And in that attempt, suffering is born. Look at your own experience. How many times have you felt anxious not about what's happening, but out of fear that something might change? How many times have you suffered in advance of a loss that hasn't even occurred yet? How many times have you clung to someone, a situation, or an outcome, generating more fear than enjoyment? Attachment turns life into a constant negotiation with the future. And when you live negotiating with the future, you are never truly at peace in the present. Buddha did not teach renouncing the world, but rather not depending on the world for well-being. That difference is key. You can love without possessing. You can enjoy without clinging. You can work without obsessing over the outcome. But that only happens when you recognize attachment in your mind. The problem is that attachment disguises itself as positive things. It disguises itself as responsibility, as ambition, as love, as care, as foresight. That's why it's so difficult to detect. But there are clear signs. Attachment arises when you feel a constant fear of loss, when you compulsively compare yourself to others, when you become disproportionately frustrated if something doesn't go as planned, when you need control to feel secure, when your emotional state depends too much on external factors. That's where the poison is at work. And here's an important truth. Attachment doesn't protect you. It chains you. It chains you to anxiety. It chains you to control. It chains you to fear. It chains you to the idea that something external must sustain your peace. The attached mind never truly rests. Even when things are going well, it fears they will stop. Buddhist wisdom proposes something radically different. Learning to observe attachment without judging it. Don't fight it. Don't blame yourself for having it. Don't try to eliminate it by force. Just look at it. See how desire arises. See how the fear of loss appears. See how the mind contracts when something falters. Because when you see attachment clearly, it stops automatically dominating you. You begin to enjoy life more and suffer less. You begin to let go without feeling like you're breaking. You begin to accept change without experiencing it as a threat. Not because the attachment suddenly disappears, but because it no longer governs your mind without you noticing. This is the first step on the path, recognizing how attachment shapes your daily life. And when you begin to see it honestly, something stirs within you. A small crack appears in the old pattern, and through that crack, clarity begins to enter. But attachment isn't the only poison. There's another that appears when reality doesn't align with your desires. A more explosive, more reactive, more destructive poison for inner peace and relationships. That poison is rejection, aversion, what we commonly call hatred. And understanding it will be the next step. When attachment doesn't get what it wants, something almost automatic happens in the mind. Aversion arises. This is the second poison that Buddha identified with absolute clarity. If attachment says, "I want this to feel good," aversion responds, "I reject this because it harms me." They seem like opposites, but they stem from the same place, the inability to accept reality as it is. Aversion doesn't always manifest as intense hatred. In fact, for most people it appears in much more subtle and normalized ways. Constant irritation, impatience, silent judgment, accumulated resentment, internal rejection, and mental phrases like, "This shouldn't be the case. This person drives me crazy. I can't stand this. It's not fair." The aversive mind lives in constant struggle, not necessarily outwardly, but inwardly. It is at war with what is happening, with what it feels, with anything that doesn't fit its expectations. And this internal war is exhausting. Buddha observed that much of human suffering comes not from pain itself, but from resistance to pain. Pain appears in everyone's life. Resistance arises only when the mind refuses to accept what is already happening. That is where suffering multiplies. Think about this. When something hurts you emotionally, what's the first thing your mind does? It doesn't just feel. It starts to protest, to demand, to reject, to look for someone to blame, to replay the scene over and over, to construct a narrative where someone is wrong, someone should change, something shouldn't have happened. That internal movement is aversion. Aversion promises you protection. It makes you believe that rejecting, criticizing, or hardening yourself will protect you from pain. But in reality, it does the opposite. It fixes the pain in your mind. It keeps it alive. It repeats it. It amplifies it. When you reject an emotion, it doesn't disappear. It intensifies. When you reject a situation, it occupies more mental space. When you reject a person, their presence becomes heavier within you. Aversion doesn't eliminate what you don't like. It drives it deep inside you. And there's something even more delicate. Many people direct their aversion inward. They judge themselves for feeling. They reject themselves for making mistakes. They mentally attack themselves for not being who they think they should be. This self-loathing is one of the most silent and destructive poisons there is. Every time you tell yourself, "I shouldn't feel this way. I'm weak for being like this. I always ruin everything," you're reinforcing the second poison. You're not correcting yourself. You're hardening yourself. The aversive mind lives in tension. The body tenses. Breathing becomes shallow. Muscles close up. The heart fights back. And from that state, it's impossible to see clearly. Buddha taught something profoundly counterintuitive. Hatred is not dissolved by more rejection. It doesn't matter how many reasons you have. It doesn't matter how justified you believe it is. Hatred, even when it seems logical, first poisons the one who harbors it. Overcoming aversion doesn't mean passively accepting everything that happens or allowing abuse. It means ceasing to fight internally against reality. It means distinguishing between acting firmly and reacting with venom. There's a huge difference between setting a boundary with clarity and attacking out of aversion. Clarity is calm. Aversion is reactive. Buddhist practice begins with something very simple yet powerful: noticing aversion the moment it arises, seeing the inner rejection, the tension, the "I don't want this," the "this is wrong," and instead of following that impulse, pausing. That pause changes everything. In that pause, you can breathe, feel your body, acknowledge the emotion without turning it into a story, accept that something hurts without turning it into a war. Acceptance doesn't mean you like what's happening. It means you stop adding unnecessary resistance. And when you remove resistance, suffering immediately diminishes. Buddha taught the practice of mindful kindness not as a moral ideal, but as a mental medicine. When you cultivate an attitude of understanding toward yourself and others, you reduce the poison of aversion. Not because everything is all right, but because you choose not to poison yourself. Understanding doesn't make you weak, it makes you strong. When you understand that people act from their level of consciousness, hatred loses its power. When you understand that you too are human and fallible, self-loathing softens. When you understand that life doesn't always conform to your expectations, the inner struggle subsides. And with that relaxation, something new appears. Space. Space to feel without drowning. Space to decide without reacting. Space to live without being in constant war. But the deepest poison remains. The one that allows both attachment and aversion to continue operating, undetected. The poison that doesn't scream, that isn't easily noticed, but that distorts the entire experience. That poison is ignorance. Not as a lack of information, but as a lack of clear vision. And understanding this changes the very root of suffering. The third poison of the mind is the most silent and, at the same time, the most decisive. Ignorance. It doesn't manifest itself as an obvious mistake or an intense emotion. It manifests itself as a habitual way of seeing life. So habitual that it is rarely questioned. In Buddhist wisdom, ignorance doesn't mean a lack of intelligence or a lack of knowledge. It means seeing reality in a distorted way. It's confusing the fleeting with the permanent, the conditioned with the absolute, the mental with the real. It's living by identifying with your thoughts and emotions as if they were your essence. When there is ignorance, the mind believes that what it thinks is true. It believes that what it feels defines who it is. It believes that external circumstances determine its worth. It believes that the past condemns it and that the future threatens it. And from that belief, attachment and aversion act without restraint. Ignorance is the fertile ground where the other two poisons grow. If you didn't see reality in a distorted way, you wouldn't cling to things with such desperation or reject them with such violence. But when perception is clouded, the mind reacts as if everything were personal, final, and dangerous. Observe your daily experience. A thought arises, "I'm not enough," and the mind doesn't question it. It believes it. An emotion emerges, anxiety, and the mind says, "This is me." A situation occurs. Something doesn't go as planned, and the mind concludes, "It's always like this." That's ignorance in action. Ignorance makes you live inside a continuous mental story without realizing it's a story. It makes you confuse the narrative with reality. And when you live trapped in the narrative, you react automatically. Buddha observed that the ignorant mind lives on autopilot. It doesn't investigate. It doesn't observe. It doesn't distinguish. It simply reacts. And in that constant reaction, suffering repeats itself over and over again. The problem isn't thinking. The problem is believing everything you think. The problem isn't feeling. The problem is identifying with everything you feel. Ignorance makes you forget something fundamental. You are the observer of the experience, not the experience itself. When a thought appears, there is something that sees it. When an emotion arises, there is something that feels it. When a reaction occurs, there is something that registers it. That something is not thought, nor emotion, nor reaction. It is consciousness. But ignorance makes you lose touch with that space and live exclusively from the content of the mind. Overcoming ignorance is not about learning more concepts, but about regaining the ability to see directly, to see without adding immediate interpretation, to see without judging, to see without identifying with. The central practice here is mindful awareness, being present with what is happening, just as it is happening, before the mind turns it into a story. When you observe attentively, something loosens. Thought loses its power. Emotion loses its drama. The situation becomes simpler. For example, anxiety arises. The ignorant mind says, "This is terrible. I shouldn't feel this way." The conscious mind observes, "There's a feeling of tension in my chest. That's all." And in that simple change, suffering diminishes. Ignorance leads you to seek external solutions to internal problems. It makes you believe that if you change the situation, your inner state will change. Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. Because the problem wasn't external, but rather in the way you perceived it. Buddha taught something profoundly liberating. You don't need life to be different to be at peace. You need to see it clearly. When ignorance weakens, you begin to notice very concrete changes. You react less. You take things less as personal attacks. You give yourself more space before responding. You feel without being overwhelmed. You think without getting lost. Not because you become indifferent, but because you regain perspective. Ignorance also manifests as the illusion of control, believing you can control everything to feel safe. When something escapes that control, fear arises. Attachment tries to hold on. Aversion tries to reject. And the cycle repeats. But when you clearly see that life is inherently uncertain, something relaxes. You stop demanding stability from something that can't provide it. And in that letting go, paradoxically, greater calm emerges. Clear vision doesn't eliminate pain, but it eliminates the confusion that amplifies it. It eliminates the idea that something is wrong with you for feeling. It eliminates the narrative of perpetual victimhood. It eliminates mental rigidity. You begin to live more gently. And here's something important. When ignorance weakens, the other two poisons also lose their power. Attachment becomes less desperate. Aversion less reactive. Because you're no longer so identified with what's happening. You see thoughts come and go. You see emotions appear and dissolve. You see situations change. And you remain. That permanence is not rigidity. It is presence. And from that presence, the mind begins to heal. But recognizing the three poisons isn't enough. Seeing them is the first step. The next is learning how to deal with them in everyday life when they appear in a conversation, a relationship, a decision, or a conflict. That's what begins to transform the daily experience. And that's where we're headed now. Recognizing the three poisons in the mind is an act of clarity. But true transformation doesn't happen simply by understanding them, but by learning to detect them the moment they appear in your daily life. Not in theory, not in a calm state, but in the midst of an uncomfortable conversation, a difficult decision, or an intense emotion. Because poisons don't act in the abstract. They act in the everyday, in the small things, in the seemingly insignificant. Attachment arises when someone doesn't respond as you expected. Aversion arises when a situation makes you uncomfortable. Ignorance arises when you assume your interpretation is the truth, and if you don't see it in time, you react. You always react. Buddha taught that suffering arises not from the event itself, but from the automatic reaction to it. Two people can experience the same situation and suffer in completely different ways. The difference lies not in what happens, but in how the mind responds internally. Therefore, practice does not consist of avoiding difficult situations, but of interrupting the automatic response. Imagine a simple scene. Someone criticizes you. In a split second, attachment arises. Attachment to the image you have of yourself, to how you want to be seen. Then aversion emerges, rejection, anger, tension. And all of this is fueled by ignorance, believing that the criticism defines who you are or that it's a personal attack. Within seconds, all three poisons are active. The mind races, the body tenses, breathing becomes shallow, words come out unfiltered, and then regret, or rumination, or inner turmoil. Buddhist wisdom proposes something different, creating a space between stimulus and response. That space is small, but crucial. In that space, you can see what is happening within you before you act. You don't need to analyze it. You don't need to judge it. Just recognize it. This is attachment. This is rejection. This is a mental story. That simple recognition already weakens the poison. When you see attachment, it no longer possesses you completely. When you see aversion, it no longer pulls you in the same way. When you see ignorance, it no longer completely confuses you. They don't disappear, but they lose power. Buddha compared the trained mind to a gatekeeper. It doesn't prevent thoughts or emotions from entering, but decides which ones pass through and which ones don't. Most people live with their gate wide open, letting everything in unfiltered. That's why they feel overwhelmed. Training the mind is learning not to let everything become your identity. An emotion is not an order. A thought is not a command. A reaction is not inevitable. When you begin to live from this understanding, your relationship with conflict changes. You no longer need to be right all the time. You no longer need to automatically defend yourself. You no longer need to react to feel safe. You start to choose. Choose to breathe before you speak. Choose not to respond immediately. Choose to observe your body before following your mind. Choose not to feed an unnecessary story. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you conscious. There's a big difference between acceptance and resignation. Buddhist acceptance isn't surrender, it's clarity. It's seeing what's happening without adding useless resistance. From that clarity, you can act firmly, but without bitterness. For example, you can set a boundary without hatred. You can say no without rejection. You can withdraw without contempt. You can correct without inner turmoil. When you act from a place of awareness, the result is different. Not just externally, but internally. You don't get stuck in the scene for hours. You don't relive the conversation. You don't get intoxicated afterward. You begin to notice something very specific. Your energy is conserved. Poisons drain your energy. Attachment keeps you tense. Aversion exhausts you. Ignorance confuses you. When you reduce their influence, you regain mental strength, emotional clarity, and inner stability. This is one of the reasons why many people feel tired all the time without knowing why. It's not just work or responsibilities. It's the mind constantly battling reality. When you stop fighting so much, you rest. And resting mentally is a profound form of healing. Daily practice isn't about obsessively monitoring yourself, but about returning again and again to presence, to the body, to the breath, to direct sensation. Because the body doesn't live in stories, it lives in the now. And the now is the natural antidote to ignorance. Every time you anchor yourself in the present, the mind calms down a little. Every time you observe without judgment, attachment softens. Every time you accept without rejection, aversion loses its power. It's not a dramatic change. It's gradual, but it's real. And something important, don't beat yourself up when the poisons appear. They will appear. It's part of the human condition. The mistake isn't that they appear, but not realizing that they have appeared. Conscience doesn't demand perfection. It demands honesty. And honestly, you begin to see patterns that once controlled you. You see how certain people trigger attachment, how certain situations awaken aversion, how certain thoughts fuel ignorance. And when you see them, you are no longer their slave. But there is still something essential to integrate: how to transform this understanding into a stable way of living, not just in specific moments of lucidity. That's the next step on the path. When you begin to see the three poisons clearly in your daily life, an inevitable question arises. How do you live without them dominating you again and again? Because understanding them intellectually is an important step, but living from that understanding is the real challenge. The Buddhist answer is not to control the mind, but to train it. And training the mind does not mean forcing it to be different, but creating the conditions for it to calm down, become clear, and order itself. Poisons thrive in confusion and haste. Clarity is born in stillness and attention. That's why one of the most common mistakes is trying to correct yourself when attachment or aversion arises. The mind tells itself, I shouldn't feel this. I have to let go. This is wrong. But this attempt at immediate correction is often laden with rejection. And then, without realizing it, you use one poison to fight another. Buddha was very clear on this. The mind is not healed through internal violence. It is healed through understanding. When attachment arises, the practice isn't to eliminate it, but to see what fear lies behind it. Because every attachment hides an insecurity. Fear of loss, fear of not being enough, fear of being alone, fear that life won't support you. When you look at that fear honestly, the attachment softens, not because it disappears, but because it ceases to be blind. When aversion arises, the practice is not to suppress anger, but to feel the tension without acting on it. Anger demands immediate action. It demands words. It demands release. But if you can remain for a moment with the bodily sensation, the heat, the stiffness, the pressure, without reacting, something shifts. The energy transforms. The mind opens. The poison loses its potency. And when ignorance arises, the practice is not to fight against thoughts, but to return to direct experience, to return to the body, to the breath, to what is happening now, not to the story the mind is telling. Everyday life offers endless opportunities for this training. You don't need special situations. You don't need absolute silence. You don't need to withdraw from the world. The training happens when someone interrupts you, when something doesn't go as planned, when an uncomfortable emotion arises, when comparisons appear, when you feel the urge to control. That's where the journey becomes real. Buddha taught that the mind is like a field. If you don't cultivate it consciously, weeds will grow. Not because you are bad, but because that's how nature works. Cultivation isn't about pulling everything up in anger, but about tending the soil. Attention, patience, perseverance. One of the most profound changes that begins to emerge with this practice is your relationship with time. Attachment tends to dwell in the future, aversion in the past, ignorance in a continuous story that isn't happening now. When you train your attention, you return to the present. And in the present, many poisons lose their power. They don't disappear completely, but they can't grow the same. In the present, you don't need to control so much. In the present, there is nothing to completely reject. In the present, the mind doesn't have so many stories to hold on to. That's why Buddhism emphasizes presence so much. Not as a nice idea, but as a practical tool for mental detoxification. When you are present, you notice attachment sooner. When you are present, you detect aversion before it explodes. When you are present, you see ignorance before it becomes certainty. And that before changes everything. You begin to respond instead of reacting. You begin to let go before you hold on too tightly. You begin to accept before you harden. Over time, this training creates something invaluable: inner confidence. Confidence that you can navigate difficult emotions without breaking down. Confidence that you don't need to control everything to be okay. Confidence that you can live without constantly poisoning yourself with your own thoughts. That confidence isn't arrogance, it's stability. And from that stability, life becomes less threatening. Not because there are no difficulties, but because you no longer face them from a place of panic or constant resistance. There's a very clear moment in this process. You realize you no longer need to run from discomfort. Before, any discomfort triggered attachment or aversion. Now, you can stay, breathe, feel, observe. And that is a profound form of freedom. A trained mind is not an empty mind. It is a mind free from intoxication. A mind that can think without getting lost, feel without drowning, and live without being constantly at war. But there is still something essential missing: how this understanding transforms the way you relate to others and to life as a whole, not just to yourself. Because poisons don't live isolated inside you. They manifest themselves especially in relationships, in bonds, in conflicts, in the expectations you project onto the world. And that's where teaching becomes even more practical. When the three poisons begin to lose their power within you, something very specific changes in the way you relate to others. You no longer interact from a place of urgency, lack, or the need to be right. You begin to relate from a broader, more stable, more conscious place. And that transforms every connection. Attachment often manifests in relationships as emotional dependency, fear of loss, a need for approval, or difficulty letting go. When attachment is dominant, you love from a place of fear. You adapt too much. You tolerate what hurts you. You keep silent about what you need to say. And all of this generates accumulated tension. Aversion, on the other hand, manifests as constant conflict, resentment, coldness, or rejection. When this poison takes hold, you shut down. You attack. You defend yourself even when it's unnecessary. You interpret the other person's actions as threats. And the relationship becomes a silent battle. Ignorance sustains both extremes. It makes you believe that the other person is the direct cause of your internal state. It makes you forget that what you feel arises from how you interpret things, not just from what happens. It makes you react without seeing the recurring pattern. When you begin to see this clearly, something profound happens. You stop using others to regulate your emotional state. You no longer need the other person to change for you to feel at peace. You no longer demand to be understood all the time. You no longer react automatically when something doesn't fit. This doesn't make you distant. It makes you emotionally responsible. You begin to notice that many arguments weren't really necessary. that many conflicts stemmed from unexpressed expectations, that many hurts came from unconscious attachments. And seeing this, you choose to act differently. For example, when someone doesn't respond as you expect, attachment is triggered. Before, this generated anxiety or reproach. Now, you see it. You breathe. And you choose not to react from a place of lack. Perhaps you ask calmly. Perhaps you wait. Perhaps you accept that not everything depends on you. When someone criticizes or contradicts you, aversion arises. Before, you responded from anger or desperation. Now, you notice the tension, you observe the impulse, and you choose to respond with clarity, or, if it's not necessary, not to respond at all. Not out of fear, but out of discernment. And when the mind starts creating stories, it's always like this. They never understand me. This is personal. Ignorance tries to take over. But now you see it. You recognize the narrative. And you return to the simple fact. What is happening now, without adding layers. This internal change has an immediate external effect. Relationships become simpler. Not necessarily easier, but clearer. There are fewer misunderstandings, less unnecessary drama, less emotional strain. You begin to set boundaries without guilt, to say no without harshness, to withdraw without resentment, to stay without losing yourself. Buddhist wisdom doesn't seek perfect relationships, it seeks conscious relationships. Relationships where you don't betray yourself to avoid conflict, nor attack to protect yourself. Relationships where you can be present without being overwhelmed. And something interesting happens when you start living like this. Some people get closer, others drift away. Not because you change others, but because you stop perpetuating dynamics you previously maintained without realizing it. Attachment made you stay where it wasn't healthy. Aversion made you break off abruptly. Ignorance made you repeat patterns. By reducing their influence, you make better choices. Your relationship with conflict also changes. You no longer see it as something to be avoided at all costs, nor as something to be won. You see it as a sign, an opportunity to observe what is triggered within you, and from there, to act with greater emotional intelligence. The conflict ceases to be a threat to your identity. It becomes information. When someone makes you uncomfortable, you can ask yourself, what part of me is holding on? What part is rejecting? What story am I believing? That question doesn't weaken you. It clarifies things. Over time, this way of relating to others creates something very valuable: inner respect. You respect yourself because you don't abandon yourself. You respect yourself because you don't poison yourself. You respect yourself because you don't react impulsively. And that inner respect is palpable. Others sense it, not because you impose anything, but because your energy shifts. There's more calm, more firmness, more coherence. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to explain too much. You don't need to defend yourself all the time. You're more anchored. And when you're anchored, life stops moving you so easily. But there is still one essential step: to integrate this way of living, not only into relationships, but into your relationship with life itself, with change, uncertainty, loss, and the passage of time. Because the three poisons don't just appear in relationships, they appear especially when life doesn't follow the script your mind expected. And that is where this wisdom becomes truly liberating. When you take this understanding beyond relationships and apply it to life itself, you begin to notice an even deeper shift. Because life, like people, doesn't always respond as you expect. It changes, it moves, it breaks down, it reorganizes. And that's where the three poisons tend to have the strongest effect. Attachment arises when you want life to be stable, predictable, and secure. When you cling to a stage of life, an identity, a role, or a specific way of being happy. Attachment makes you say internally, "This should stay this way." And when life changes, because it always does, fear emerges. Aversion arises when life takes something away from you, frustrates you, or forces you to go through a difficult time. You reject what happens. You fight against it. You ask yourself, why you? You get angry at reality. And this internal struggle transforms natural pain into prolonged suffering. Ignorance sustains both movements. It makes you believe that change is a threat, that pain is a mistake, that something went wrong with you or with life. It makes you forget that impermanence is not a flaw in the system, but its very nature. Buddha taught that much human suffering stems from resisting change. Not because change is easy, but because trying to stop it is impossible. And when you try to stop the impossible, you exhaust yourself. Notice how much energy you waste trying to hold on to things that are already changing. People who are no longer the same. Stages that have run their course. Versions of yourself that no longer fit. Expectations that life doesn't want to fulfill. Attachment tells you that if you let go, you'll lose something essential. Aversion tells you that if you accept, you'll surrender. Ignorance tells you there's no other option but to fight. But Buddhist wisdom proposes something different. Learning to let go without breaking down. To accept without resigning yourself. To go through change without losing yourself. Accepting impermanence doesn't mean you like what happens. It means you stop fighting reality. And when you stop fighting, you regain energy, clarity, direction. Life stops feeling like an enemy and starts feeling like a process. When you integrate this, something softens within you. You no longer need everything to be under control to be at peace. You begin to trust more in your ability to adapt, in your resilience, in your inner strength. That confidence isn't naivete, it's experience. It's having seen that you can get through tough times without breaking down. It's having proven that emotions pass, that situations change, and that you change too. Ignorance loses its power when you remember this. Attachment relaxes when you know you can let go. Aversion softens when you understand that fighting doesn't protect you. You begin to live with more flexibility, with less mental rigidity, with more openness. And that openness doesn't make you fragile, it makes you adaptable. Life ceases to be a succession of threats and becomes a series of experiences. Some pleasant, others painful, all transitory. And in the midst of that transience, you begin to find something stable, your presence. Not presence as a spiritual concept, but as a direct experience. Being here, feeling your body, breathing, seeing what is happening without adding an unnecessary story. That presence becomes your refuge when everything changes. Buddha didn't offer external certainties. He offered an inner foundation, a place to return to when the mind is troubled. And that place doesn't depend on life being perfect. When you live from that place, problems don't disappear, but they no longer define you. Losses hurt, but they don't break you. Uncertainties are uncomfortable, but they don't paralyze you. You begin to see suffering differently, not as punishment, but as a sign that some poison is at work, that there is attachment, rejection, or confusion. And by seeing it, you are no longer in the dark. Clarity becomes your ally. Your relationship with fear also changes. Fear loses its power when you understand that you don't need to control everything to be okay, that you can feel fear and still move forward, that you can not know and still trust. That confidence isn't blind. It's a confidence based on the experience of having supported you before, of having gotten back up, of having made it through. And when you live like this, something profound happens. Your identity ceases to depend so much on external factors. You are no longer just what you do, what you have, or what happens to you. You are also the one who observes, the one who learns, the one who adapts. That broader identity is less vulnerable to poisons. Attachment no longer has as much to hold on to. Aversion no longer needs to defend you so fiercely. Ignorance can no longer so easily convince you of absolute truths. You begin to live with more humility and calm. Humility to accept that you don't control everything. Calm to know that you don't need to. And from there, life becomes more habitable. But there's still an important question to answer. How to integrate all of this into a stable way of life, not just as a fleeting understanding. How to transform this clarity into an ongoing journey. That's the final step. Reaching this point doesn't mean the three poisons have disappeared from your life. It means something much more real and much more valuable. They no longer silently rule your mind. Now you know how to recognize them. And when something stops operating in the shadows, it loses much of its power. The Buddhist transformation was never instantaneous. It was never magical. It was never an empty promise. It was, and still is, a process of seeing clearly again and again. Seeing how the mind clings. Seeing how it rejects. Seeing how it becomes confused. And instead of punishing yourself for it, learning. Because learning is different from harshly correcting yourself. Learning is observing, understanding, and patiently adjusting. And that patience is part of wisdom. When attachment arises, you can now recognize it without fear. You no longer need to run from it or justify it. You know that behind it lies a need for security, a desire for control, an attempt to protect yourself. And by seeing it this way, attachment softens. Not because you force it, but because you understand it. When aversion arises, it no longer surprises you. You notice the tension, the urge to reject, the rigidity. And instead of acting from that place, you choose to pause, to breathe, to feel, to let the emotion express itself without becoming internal or external violence. And in that pause, the rejection loses its power. When ignorance arises, when the mind tries to convince you that its story is the absolute truth, you now have a powerful tool: presence. You return to your body, to your breath, to the present moment. And you remember that a thought is not a fact, that an emotion is not an identity, that a situation does not define your entire life. That remembering is the heart of the journey. Life never ceases to present challenges. Difficult people, unexpected changes, losses, uncertainty. But now you face all of that from a different place, not from mental fog, but from clarity. And that clarity doesn't make you invulnerable. It makes you human in a more conscious way. You begin to live with less rigidity, with less need to be right, with less fear of losing, with less rejection of what hurts, with fewer absolute narratives, and at the same time, with more presence, more calm, more discernment, more compassion, more inner freedom. The freedom that Buddhism proposes is not about always doing what you want. It's about not being a slave to the mind's automatic impulses. It's about being able to choose how to respond. It's about being able to let go without destroying yourself. It's about being able to feel without losing yourself. When you look back, you realize how much energy you wasted fighting against reality, how many unnecessary internal battles, how many stories that only existed in your mind. And seeing that, something loosens. Life becomes a little lighter. Not perfect, not ideal, but more livable. You begin to trust more in your ability to get through whatever comes your way. Not because you're invincible, but because you know you can observe, adapt, and learn. And that confidence changes the way you walk through the world. You no longer need everything to be under control to be at peace. You no longer need others to change to feel good. You no longer need absolute certainty to move forward. Simply being present is enough for you. Buddha taught that suffering arises when we confuse what happens with who we are. When we believe that attachment defines us, that rejection is necessary, that confusion is inevitable. But it isn't. You are not attachment. You are not aversion. You are not ignorance. You are the one who can see them. And that ability to see is the seed of all transformation. From here on, the path isn't about eliminating anything, but about living with greater clarity. About using every experience as an opportunity to observe the mind. About remembering, again and again, that you can choose not to poison yourself. Sometimes you'll fall into old patterns. Other times, you'll react without realizing it. That doesn't mean you've regressed. It means you're still human. The difference is that now you know how to get back. Return to breathing. Return to the body. Return to observation. Return to clarity. And each time you return, you strengthen something deep within yourself. A stability that doesn't depend on life being easy. A calm that doesn't demand perfection. A wisdom that doesn't need to be imposed. That is the true teaching of the three poisons. Not to point out what is wrong with you, but to show you how to free yourself from unnecessary suffering. When the mind is no longer intoxicated, life doesn't become perfect, but it becomes more real. And in that reality, you can live with more honesty, more balance, and more peace. That's the way. And it always begins with seeing clearly what's happening inside you.